In the morning, my mother called me and told me not to come home. That was the first thing that scared me. Not the foreclosure notice she was crying about. Not even the fact that my brother's house was apparently in serious trouble. It was the way she said those 5 words. Don't come home, Elena, like my being there would somehow make things worse. For 15 years, I'd been the person my family called when there was a bill nobody could pay. My father's medical expenses, my brother's failed business, his truck, his rent. I had quietly covered more than I ever told anyone. And now, when their house was at risk, my mother didn't ask me to help. She told me to stay away. What she didn't know was that I already had something in my possession that could change everything. I'd been carrying it for years, tucked away in a place nobody in my family knew about. And it had my father's handwriting on it. Maybe I should explain how I became the person everyone called when they needed saving. My name is Elena Hartley, and I am 43 years old. At 2001 4 in the morning, my phone lit up the ceiling of my bedroom with my mother's name on it, and in 11 years of marriage, that had happened exactly once before, the night my father died. I answered thinking someone else was gone, my heart already halfway to the worst possible version of the call before I'd even said hello. Instead, my mother's voice came through thin and fast. The voice of someone who has been crying long enough that crying has turned into something else, a kind of scraped-out flatness underneath the panic. She said the bank had called Derek that afternoon. She said there was a claim on the house, a real one filed with the county, and that a man from the title company had used the word foreclosure like it was a normal word to say to a grandmother at dinner. Then she said the thing I will remember for the rest of my life, the reason I'm telling you this story at all. She said, "Don't come home. Please, Elena. Whatever you do, don't come home." What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been carrying the answer to her entire crisis in a manila folder in my home office for 5 years, and that the folder had my father's handwriting in it. If you're watching this and you've ever been the one who paid the bills nobody thanked you for, stay with me, because I need you to understand something before we go any further. This isn't a story about revenge. I never wanted the house. What I wanted for 15 years was to be seen. Comment below and tell me the moment you realized you'd become the family's emergency fund instead of its daughter, its son, its sibling. I read every single one. Let me take you back, because none of this makes sense unless you understand where it started. I grew up in Colton Mills, Ohio, a town of about 4,000 people built around a bearing and axle plant that closed twice and reopened twice before I turned 18. My father, Walter Hartley, worked the line there for 29 years. The last 11 of them as a floor foreman, and he wore the same style of steel-toed boots his whole life because he said new ones never broke in right. My mother, Carol, kept the books for our church for 2 decades and ran our house the way some people run a courtroom. There was a right way to fold a towel. There was a right way to answer the phone. And there was a right child. That was Derek. My brother is 3 years younger than me, and from the time he was small he had a gift for being forgiven. He put a golf ball through the neighbor's window and somehow ended up eating cookies at that neighbor's table an hour later. He failed algebra twice, and my mother framed his participation certificate from a regional soccer tournament like it was a diploma. I'm not telling you this to make him sound like a villain. He wasn't, not back then. He was just a kid who learned early that charm worked better than effort, and nobody in our house ever gave him a reason to learn otherwise. I was the other kind of kid. I did the extra credit. I got a partial scholarship to Ohio State for accounting, and when my mother mentioned it to people at church, she'd say it the way you'd mention that a gutter had finally stopped leaking. Useful, handled. Not exactly a celebration. My father was quieter about it, but on the morning I left for school he pressed $40 into my hand, folded into a small, tight square, and said, "Don't tell your mother." That was Walter Hartley's whole love language. Quiet, and slightly against the rules. I want to introduce you to someone here, because she matters more to this story than almost anyone with my last name. Her name is Ruth, and she's my mother-in-law. I met my husband Daniel in my 2nd year at Ohio State, and I met Ruth about 4 months later, at a kitchen table in Dayton where she handed me a plate of food before she'd even learned how I took my coffee. Ruth Reyes worked 31 years as a school nurse, and she has never once, in the 15 years I've known her, made me feel like a bill she was owed. When my father got sick years later, Ruth was the one who drove 2 hours on a Tuesday, unasked, just to sit with me in a hospital cafeteria and let me not talk. She learned to crochet the year Daniel and I got married, badly at first, and by the time our first daughter was born, 6 years into my marriage, she'd made her a blanket in a yellow and gray pattern that still folded on the back of our couch, soft in the middle from a decade of use. Every Sunday at 7, without fail, my phone rings, and it's Ruth, asking about nothing in particular, the weather, a recipe, whether I've eaten dinner yet, never once a request attached to the question. I'll come back to Ruth. I want you to remember her because everything my own mother wasn't, Ruth was, quietly, the whole time. My father's illness started when I was 23, a little over a year out of college and just starting my first job at a regional accounting firm. It began as fatigue nobody took seriously and turned, within 2 years, into a heart condition that required medication my parents' insurance covered about 60% of, and then a series of hospitalizations that covered even less. My mother did not work outside the church office. My brother, at that point, was 20 years old. Between community college attempts, living at home, and driving a truck my parents had co-signed for that he was 3 payments behind on. So, I started paying, not all at once. It crept in the way debt always does, one favor at a time. First it was $340 for a cardiology copay my mother said she'd figure out later. Then it was covering the electric bill for 2 months when my father was between disability approvals. By the time I was 26, I had a standing $600 automatic transfer going to my parents' checking account every month, and I had told myself it was temporary. It was not temporary. It lasted, in some form, for 15 years. Here's the part where my profession becomes relevant, because it's going to shape the rest of this story. I became a forensic accountant. Not right away, but that early habit of tracking every dollar I sent home turned into a career built entirely on the same instinct. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. By 30, I was doing fraud examination work for a firm in Columbus, the kind of job where you spend your day reconciling what people say happened against what the ledger actually shows. I want to be clear about something because I've thought about this a lot. I did not become a person who counts things because of what my family did to me. I think I was always going to be that person. But my family gave me 15 years of very good practice. Item 1, if you want to think of it that way, was that $340 copay. Item 2 was the electric bill. By the time my father died, the folder I kept, an actual physical folder, not a metaphor, at the back of my filing cabinet, had 41 items in it. Wire transfers. Copies of checks. A spreadsheet with a running total that I updated on the first of every month like it was a mortgage payment, because in a way, it was. That folder is going to matter again later. Hold on to it. I want to tell you about Derek during those years too, because the money didn't only flow to my parents. In my late 20s, my brother asked me for $8,500 to start a landscaping business. I gave it to him without asking my parents, and without really expecting to see it again, which was good, because I never did. 4 years later, it was $12,000 for a truck when his first one got repossessed. 2 years after that, $6,200 to cover back rent on his apartment when his landscaping business folded and he moved back in with his wife's parents for a stretch. Every single time, my mother's line was the same, and I want you to remember it because it comes back later in this story, word for word. She would call me, and her voice would soften into something almost affectionate, and she'd say, "Derek needs it. You don't." 4 words. Not a request, a verdict. I never once heard her say thank you in a way that didn't have an asterisk on it. What I heard, instead, over and over, dressed up in different sentences, was some version of, "You're the responsible one, Elena, that's just who you are, so of course you don't mind." As if responsibility were a personality trait I'd been born with instead of a role I'd been assigned at 23 and never once been asked if I wanted. By the time I was 31, I had married Daniel, and we had built a modest life in a suburb outside Columbus, 2 hours from Colton Mills, a life that from the outside looked comfortable and from the inside looked like a second, invisible mortgage. Daniel never once complained about the money going out the door every month. What he did do, quietly, was start his own version of my folder, without telling me, a small notebook where he wrote down every time my mother called asking for something, because he'd noticed something I hadn't let myself notice yet. The calls only ever went one direction. If you've ever been the one who sends the money and gets asked why you didn't send more, I need you to drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight because I promise you, you are not the only one carrying this, even if it feels that way at 2 in the morning. The years blurred together after that in the particular way that caretaking years do. Year 5 was the year my mother first used the phrase that would end up defining the whole rest of the story, though none of us knew it yet. Derek had asked for $2,700 to cover a semester of a business certificate program he never finished, and when I hesitated, just for a moment, just long enough to do the math on my own checking account out loud, my mother cut in on the call and said flatly, "Derek needs it. You don't." 4 words delivered so plainly it took me a second to register them as a decision rather than a question. I paid it. Of course I paid it. But I wrote the sentence down that night in the back of my planner, word for word, the way you'd log evidence, though I didn't yet understand that's what I was doing. Year 6 of the 15 was the year my father had his first stent placed, and I flew back to Colton Mills 9 times, using vacation days I never took for myself. Year 7 was the year my father's first cardiologist retired, and the new one, a younger doctor with a habit of talking directly to me instead of to my parents, sat me down in a hallway and explained, gently, that the plan going forward would require a specialist 2 hours away, in Columbus, near where I already lived, which meant that for the better part of 2 years I was the one driving my father to appointments, not because my mother couldn't, but because she said the highway made her nervous and Derek's schedule never seemed to line up. I logged those drives too, 44 of them over 22 months, an hour and 50 minutes each way, which meant I spent, by my own count, roughly 161 hours in a car with my father during those 2 years, more consecutive hours alone with him. Some of the only real conversations I ever had with Walter Hartley happened in that car. Both of us watching the same stretch of interstate, him talking a little more freely than he ever did at the kitchen table, maybe because neither of us had to look at the other one while we did it. Year 9 was the year Derek's second marriage started, to a woman named Jenna, who I liked immediately and who I think deserved better information than she got about the family she was marrying into. Year 11 was the year my mother asked me, over Thanksgiving dinner, in front of Daniel and Ruth, whether I'd given any more thought to helping Derek with a down payment on a house, in the same tone she might use to ask if I'd tried a new casserole recipe. I said I'd think about it. I gave him $14,000 the following March. Ruth was the one who found me crying in her kitchen 2 weeks later, not because of the money, but because nobody had asked how I was doing that whole weekend, not once. Year 8 was the year I almost stopped. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important for anyone watching this who's in the middle of their own version of these years to know it wasn't a straight line for me either. Daniel and I had been saving, quietly, for a down payment on our first house, and we were $4,000 short of what we needed for the place we wanted. A small brick, 2-bedroom with a maple tree in the front yard that I'd driven past a dozen times just to look at it. That same week, my mother called about a hospital bill for exactly $4,100. I remember standing in our kitchen holding both numbers in my head at once, the house and the bill, and really understanding for the first time that I could not have both. I sent the money. We didn't get the house. Ruth found out, somehow, the way Ruth always seemed to know things, and she showed up 2 days later with a check for $4,000 of her own, no strings on it, just a note that said, "For the Maple Tree House. Love, Ruth." We didn't end up getting that exact house, someone else had already closed on it by the time we were ready, but we bought 1-4 streets over the following spring, and I've never once told my mother where that down payment actually came from. It wasn't hers to know. Year 10 was the year Derek asked me, over a call I still remember almost word for word, whether I'd consider just being on paper for a loan he wanted to take out for a used box truck, since his own credit, in his words, was kind of a mess right now. I said no. It was the first time in 10 years I'd said no to a direct ask, and I remember my hand shaking on the phone afterward, not from anger, but from how unfamiliar the word felt in my own mouth. My mother called 40 minutes later and asked if everything was okay with me, because Derek says you sounded upset, not because I'd said no, because I'd sounded upset while doing it. That was the year I started, very quietly, keeping a second column in my spreadsheet, one I never showed anyone, tracking not the dollars but the number of times someone in my family asked how I was doing, without a request for money attached to the question. By year 12, that column had 3 entries in it. 3, across 4 years. I drove to Colton Mills every other weekend for 11 months. I learned to read his discharge paperwork better than the home health aide did. I sat with him at 4 a.m. More times than I can count, though I did count, because that's who I am. 61 nights. I know that number, the way other people know their anniversary. He died on a Tuesday in March, 4 weeks before I turned 38. I want to tell you something about my father here, something small, because it matters for later. About 2 years before he died, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon when my mother had gone to a church board meeting, he called me into his study, which was really just a converted mudroom with a walnut writing desk he'd bought secondhand in the 80s. He handed me a small brass key on a piece of fishing line and told me to keep it somewhere safe and not tell anyone I had it. Not even Daniel, he said, at least not yet. When I asked him what it was for, he just said, just in case. Don't go looking, you'll know when. I put it on my own keyring and, being an accountant, I filed the moment away and moved on with my life, the way you do with things that don't make sense yet. I did not open that desk. Not then. Not for 5 more years. I want you to remember that because it's the whole hinge this story swings on. I should tell you a little more about who my father actually was, because most of this story is about my mother and my brother, and he tends to fade into the background of his own house the way he did in real life. Walter Hartley voted in every election but never talked about who for. He kept a coffee can of loose change on the kitchen windowsill his whole life and never once explained what it was for. And after he died, we found nearly $900 in it, in nickels and dimes, like he'd been quietly saving for something none of us ever got to ask about. He was not a warm man in any way you could put your finger on. He didn't hug easily. He called me kid until the week he died, even though I was 37 years old by then. But he showed up. Every hospital visit he was well enough to attend. Every phone call I made about a bill, he answered. And at the end of almost every one of those calls, quietly, almost like an afterthought, he'd say, "I see what you're doing for us, kid." I see it. My mother never once said anything close to that sentence, not in 15 years. The funeral was small, appropriate for a man who spent 29 years on a factory floor and never once wanted attention. What followed it, 6 weeks later, was not small. My mother called it a family meeting. Really, it was an inheritance meeting, and she had invited, by my count, 23 relatives, aunts and uncles and cousins I hadn't seen in years, into my parents' living room on a Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to honor your father's wishes. I want to describe this room to you exactly as it was, because I've replayed it more times than I can count. 14 folding chairs borrowed from the church, arranged in careful rows like it was a sermon instead of a family, my mother's good tablecloth on the dining table even though nobody was eating, and a manila envelope in my mother's hands that I would later learn contained a will my father had signed 2 years before he died, before, as far as I understood it, he'd given me that key. I remember Derek sitting near the window, not meeting my eyes, and Jenna beside him, her hand resting on his knee in a way that looked less like affection and more like she was holding him in place. The will left the house to Derek outright. Free and clear, my mother said, her voice doing the thing it did in church announcements, warm and final at the same time. There was a modest life insurance payout split between us, roughly $19,000 each, which I noted, out of habit, was less than what I had put into that house in the last 3 years alone. And then my mother, standing in front of 23 relatives, in front of my husband, in front of Ruth, who had driven 2 hours to be there, said the sentence that ended something in me. This house was always going to be Derek's. Elena has Daniel, she has her career, she's fine. Derek has nothing without us. And frankly, she said, looking directly at me, I'd think you'd be grateful. Not everyone gets to be the responsible one. 23 people in that room. I counted them again, twice, while she talked because counting was the only thing keeping my hands still. Nobody said anything for what I clocked at 11 seconds, which is a very long time in a room that full. Then my Aunt Denise cleared her throat and asked if there'd be coffee. I did not raise my voice. I want to be honest with you about that, because I've told this story enough times now to know people expect a scene, expect me to have stood up and listed every dollar right there in that living room. I didn't. I sat with my hands folded, the way you learn to sit in rooms where you've already lost, and I said, "Understood." One word. Then I stood up, thanked my aunt for the coffee she hadn't yet made, hugged exactly the relatives who deserved it, and left. Ruth called that night and just said, "I'm proud of how you handled that," which was the only thing anyone said to me that entire week that felt true. Aunt Denise, for what it's worth, never did get her coffee that afternoon. My mother forgot the whole exchange had happened, wrapped up as she was in the paperwork, and the folding chairs were still being stacked when I left. I've thought about that detail more than I probably should. The coffee nobody made, small and stupid and somehow exactly the right size for everything that day. I never told them about the key. I never told them my father had handed me a piece of fishing line 2 years before he died and asked me not to look yet. As far as my mother and my brother knew, I walked out of that house with nothing but a folding chair's worth of humiliation and a modest check. What they didn't know was that I still had that key on my ring, and that somewhere in the back of my mind, in the part of me that reconciles ledgers for a living, a small, quiet voice had already started asking why a man who barely spoke above a whisper had gone to the trouble of a secret key at all. If this story is landing anywhere close to home for you, hit subscribe now, but only if it's actually earning it, because I've got a long way still to go, and I promise you the second half of this is not what you expect. I didn't open the desk that week. I didn't open it that year. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters more than the mechanics of what came next. I wasn't protecting a secret. I was protecting myself. I had just buried my father and been publicly told in front of half my extended family that gratitude was the correct response to being erased. Opening a locked drawer felt, at the time, like one more task on a list I was tired of being the only one to finish. So the key stayed on my ring, and the folder with 41 items stayed in my filing cabinet, and I built a wall between Colton Mills and the rest of my life, brick by brick, over about 18 months. I want to tell you what those 18 months actually looked like, because this is the part people skip when they imagine walking away from a family. It is not clean. It is not a montage. It is a slow, granular process of unbecoming useful. I stopped answering my mother's calls on the first ring. I let voicemails sit for 2, sometimes 3 days. Derek texted me twice that first year, both times about money, once for a 3100 repair on the truck he still owed me for, and I said no both times, and both times my stomach hurt for a week afterward, because saying no to my family had never once, in 15 years, been a muscle I'd let myself use. I remember the specific week it stopped feeling like grief and started feeling like a decision. It was a Thursday in October, 7 months after the funeral, and my mother called about a gutter that needed replacing on the house, 1,850, and she asked, almost casually, whether I could handle that one since Derek's tight this month. I sat with the phone against my ear for what I counted afterward as 6 full seconds of silence before I said, "No, Mom. I can't." She didn't argue. She just said, "Oh, okay then," in a voice that made it clear she'd expected a different answer and was recalculating in real time. That was the first bill I ever refused in 15 years, and it cost me nothing financially and everything emotionally, because for about 2 weeks afterward I kept waiting for some disaster to prove I'd made the wrong call. No disaster came. Derek found 11850 somewhere, or the gutter waited. I never found out which, and the house did not fall down, and neither did I. My career, meanwhile, kept moving quietly in the background, the way things do when you finally stop pouring your attention somewhere else. I made senior manager at my firm the year after my father died. 2 years after that, I was made partner, the youngest one in the firm's history, and a business journal in Columbus ran a small profile on me, 400 words, mostly about a fraud case I'd helped unwind involving a mid-sized manufacturing company that had been quietly cooking its books for 6 years. Nobody in Colton Mills read that journal. As far as I knew, my mother had no idea any of it had happened. Derek's life, in that same stretch, was moving in a different direction. He and Jenna had 2 kids by then, and he'd taken out a home equity line against the house, to fund a third attempt at a landscaping business, this one under a fancier name with a logo Jenna's cousin had designed for free. I learned this the way you learn most things about family you've stopped talking to, secondhand, through a cousin named Patty who never quite understood the concept of a boundary and who, God bless her, is the reason any of this eventually came to light. It was Patty who called me one Sunday evening, not to check in, but because she'd seen something in a family group chat I wasn't on anymore and thought I'd want to know. I want to read you, as close to verbatim as I can recall it, what she described, because it's the moment the second half of the story actually starts. According to Patty, my mother had written, in a chat that included Derek, Jenna, and 3 cousins, the bank called again. "Derek, you need to talk to your sister. She's a numbers person. She'll want this done clean, not messy. Do not mention the lien first. Just say a title issue. And don't let Daniel be in the room, he'll turn it into a whole thing." I sat with that for a long time before I said anything back to Patty. A lien. Not a title issue. A lien. Specific enough to be named, specific enough that the bank had called about it more than once. I didn't know yet what it was attached to. I only knew, sitting in my kitchen with my phone against my ear, that something with a legal weight I hadn't created was sitting on my brother's house, and that my mother's first instinct on learning about it had not been to ask me what I knew. It had been to workshop how to manage me. Patty, to her credit, sent me a screenshot 2 days later, unprompted, after I hadn't asked her to. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I've never confirmed every word of it directly with my mother, and I don't think I need to, given everything that came after. But the screenshot showed a message from Derek to the group, 17 minutes after my mother's, that read, "She's not going to want to fight. She never wants a fight. Just get her in a room where she feels comfortable and let Mom handle the talking." Comfortable. As if 15 years of quietly funding this family had earned me the reputation of someone who could be managed into comfort instead of someone who might, eventually, simply stop showing up. That was the moment, if I'm honest, that pushed me from confused to methodical. Confusion is not a state I stay in for very long professionally, and I don't think I stayed in it for very long personally either. I opened a blank document on my laptop that night, the same kind of document I open at the start of every fraud engagement at work, and wrote a single line at the top: what do I actually know, and what do I need to confirm? Underneath it, I wrote 2 words: the lien. I did not call my mother that night. What I did the next morning was drive to my office 2 hours early before anyone else was in the building and pull the county's public land records for my parents' address. This is not a dramatic skill. It's the most boring part of my job, the part I've done 1,000 times for strangers' companies, usually for people I've never met, trying to figure out where their business partner hid the money. I never expected to run that same search on 214 Larkspur Lane. It took me 11 minutes to find it. A deed of trust, recorded 4 years and 7 months earlier, roughly 6 months after my father died, in the amount of $166,850, naming Elena Hartley as beneficiary, secured against the property at 214 Larkspur Lane. My parents' house, my father's house, I printed it. I have never, in 11 years of forensic work, printed a document with my hands shaking the way they were that morning. I read the recording date 3 separate times, because my brain kept trying to make it say something other than what it said. Filed 6 months after his death, which meant somebody had walked it into the county recorder's office themselves, on purpose, after he was already gone, on his instructions. I called Roger Voss's office that same morning, before I'd even told Daniel, and asked, as flatly as I could manage, whether he remembered handling a filing under that name around that date. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I counted it, 9 seconds, before he said, carefully, "I think we should talk in person, Elena." I remember sitting completely still at my desk for what I later realized, because I checked the clock, was almost 4 minutes. 4 minutes of not moving, staring at a document with my own name on it that I had never signed, never seen, never once been told existed. My father had died 6 months before that document was filed. Which meant either someone had forged it after his death, which felt impossible for reasons I'll explain in a moment, or he had prepared it himself before he died and arranged for it to be recorded on a delay. That's when I remembered the key. I want to slow down here because this is the pivot point of everything, and I don't want to rush past it the way I almost rushed past it in real life, in my hurry to understand. I drove to Colton Mills that weekend, alone, and let myself into the house using the spare key Ruth still kept, because my mother was at a church retreat and Derek's family was in the middle of, ironically, a landscaping job 2 towns over. I went straight to the mudroom study, to the walnut desk my father bought secondhand in the 80s, and I used the brass key on the fishing line for the first time in 7 years. The house smelled the way it always had, like the specific brand of lemon furniture polish my mother had used my entire life, and for a second, standing in the doorway of that mudroom, I almost lost my nerve entirely. The bottom left drawer stuck a little, the way it always had, and I had to lift up on the handle at the same time I pulled, a trick I'd watched my father do 100 times as a kid without ever once asking why the drawer didn't just get fixed. Inside, there was a single manila envelope, my name written on the front in my father's small, careful, factory-line handwriting, the same handwriting from 40 years of grocery lists and birthday cards that never said much more than, "Happy birthday, kid, love Dad." Inside the envelope were 3 things. A copy of the deed of trust, notarized, dated 8 months before he died, not after, which meant he had signed it himself, in secret, and instructed his attorney, a man named Roger Voss, who I later confirmed still practiced 2 towns over, to hold it and record it 6 months after his death, quietly, without notifying anyone. The second thing in the envelope was a copy of my own spreadsheet. My spreadsheet, the one from my filing cabinet at home, the one with the running total I'd updated every first of the month for over a decade. I have never once given my father a copy of that spreadsheet. I have never once, in 15 years, shown either of my parents an itemized account of what I'd sent them. Which meant, at some point, without my knowledge, my father had been keeping his own version. His numbers didn't match mine exactly. His were higher. He'd counted things I hadn't, gas money for the drives, meals I'd bought during hospital stays, a rental car once when mine broke down 2 states from home. Where my running total sat at 172,400, his sat at 119,910. My father, a man who barely finished a full sentence about his feelings in 67 years of life, had apparently spent a decade quietly reconciling my sacrifice against his own memory, the way I reconcile a company's books against what actually happened. The third thing in the envelope was a letter. I'm not going to read you every word of it because some things a person writes to their daughter in secret, believing she may not find it for years, deserve to stay mostly between the two of them. I'll tell you what it said in substance. He wrote that he knew what I'd given up, that he'd watched his wife take it for granted in a way that shamed him more than he ever said out loud, and that he could not undo the will because he did not have the strength left in his last year for the fight that would have caused inside his own marriage. But he said he could not let the house pass to Derek clean either, not after everything, not without something in place that would make sure I was never simply erased from the math of it. He also wrote that he'd asked Roger to hold the filing for 6 months after his death specifically so it wouldn't look, to anyone watching, like a deathbed change of heart, something a lawyer could argue was made under duress or a failing mind. He wanted it clean, recorded quietly, on its own timeline, standing on nothing but the numbers themselves. That was Walter Hartley's version of a love letter, a man making sure that even his last gift to me could survive an audit. He wrote, And this is the one line I will give you exactly as he wrote it, because I've thought about it every day since. I couldn't give you the house. I could at least make sure nobody could pretend you didn't build half of it. I sat on the floor of that mudroom for what I know, because I looked at my phone before and after, was 42 minutes. I did not cry the way you might expect. I felt, more than anything, the specific, quiet click of a ledger finally balancing. Somebody had seen it? My father had seen it the whole time, every dollar, every drive, every 4 a.m. shift at his bedside, and he had done the only thing a quiet man with no leverage left in his own house knew how to do. He'd made me a creditor. I took the envelope home. I told Daniel everything that night at our kitchen table, and I remember he didn't say much either at first, just reached over and put his hand flat on top of mine for a long moment before he finally said, "You don't have to decide anything tonight." I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell Derek. I let the deed of trust sit, unenforced, in my safe deposit box for the better part of 5 years, because I meant what I told you at the start of this story. I never wanted the house. What I wanted was for the ledger to exist somewhere, even if nobody but me and a dead man ever looked at it again. Then Derek refinanced. That's the part my mother's 2 a.m. call was actually about, even if she didn't say it in those words. A title search, standard for any refinance, had turned up a recorded deed of trust for $166,850 in my name that nobody in the family had disclosed, because nobody in the family, aside from my father's attorney, knew it existed until the title company flagged it. The bank had paused the refinance. Then Derek had missed 2 payments on the home equity line he'd taken out for his third landscaping attempt, and the combination of the missed payments and the undisclosed lien had triggered exactly what my mother had heard the word for on the phone with a man from the title company. Foreclosure. "Don't come home," she'd said. "Not come home and help us. Not come home so we can talk. Don't come home," because even at 2 a.m., mid-crisis, some part of my mother was still managing optics, still more afraid of what the neighbors or the relatives might see than of what her son might lose. I need to tell you something before we go further, and it's the last thing you need to know before this all comes to a head. In the 18 months after Patty's phone call and my afternoon in that mudroom, my career had kept climbing in ways my family still had no idea about. That business journal profile turned into 2 more, and then, about a year before that 2 a.m. call, into a segment on a regional business news program about my firm's fraud examination work, 4 minutes, my face on a screen in living rooms across 3 counties, including, though I didn't know it at the time, a church member's living room in Colton Mills, a woman who mentioned it to my mother the following Sunday with the specific, needling warmth of small towns everywhere. "Wasn't that your Elena on the news? Look at her now." That, as much as the lien itself, is what finally cracked my mother's silence toward me after 5 years. Not love, not grief. The sudden, uncomfortable recalculation of what I might now be worth to her again. If you've ever watched a family suddenly rediscover you the moment your circumstances changed, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments, because that particular kind of hurt has a very specific shape, and I don't think enough people talk about it honestly. The 2 a.m. call was not the only call. Over the following 9 days, my mother called 4 more times, my brother twice, and Jenna, my sister-in-law, once, late on a Thursday, her voice low like she was hiding in a bathroom. What Jenna told me in that one call mattered more than anything my mother or Derek said and all the others combined. She told me the bank had given them 30 days to either satisfy the lien or begin the process of losing the house, and that Derek had not told her, until the title search forced it, that any of this money had ever existed, that his sister had spent 15 years functioning as the family's unlisted line of credit. "I didn't know," she said. "I want you to know I didn't know, and I'm sorry, whatever happens." I believed her. I still do. I did not agree to anything on the phone. What I did the following week was call Roger Voss, my father's old attorney, and confirm that the deed of trust was valid, properly recorded, and fully enforceable. I was not building a case against my family. I want to say that clearly, because it would have been easy for this to become something ugly and legal and permanent. I was confirming that the thing my father built for me actually held. The same way you confirm a foundation is sound before you decide whether to build anything on top of it. Then I called my mother back and told her I would come to Colton Mills on my own terms, and that I wanted to meet at Roger Voss's office, not at the house. I told her Derek and Jenna should be there. I did not tell her why I'd chosen a lawyer's conference room instead of her dining table. I think by then some part of her already knew. We met on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the 2 a.m. call, in a small conference room with a table that sat 8 and windows that looked out onto the same main street I'd grown up walking down. Daniel came with me and sat near the door, not saying a word for the entire meeting, which is exactly what I asked him to do beforehand, because his silence, his simple physical presence, said more than any argument he could have made. My mother arrived with a printed list in her hand, and I noted, out of the old habit that never really leaves you, that the paper was folded into the same tight little square my father used to fold $40 bills into. Some habits skip a generation sideways. Roger's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street that used to be a hardware store when I was a kid, and I remember noting as we climbed the stairs that the paint on the railing was the same faded green it had been my whole childhood, one of those small towns where almost nothing changes except the people inside it. Daniel squeezed my hand once at the bottom of the stairs and didn't say anything, which was exactly what I needed him not to say. She started before I'd even fully sat down. "We need this resolved today," she said. "Derek's family could lose their home, Elena. Whatever this note is, whatever your father was thinking, I need you to release it. You don't need this money. You have a career now, apparently, a whole television thing," and there was something in the way she said television thing, clipped and a little bitter, that told me exactly how much that 4-minute segment had cost her socially, in whatever version of currency she cared about most. "You owe this family a fresh start," I let her finish. I counted, out of that same old habit, 63 words in that opening demand. Then I opened the folder I'd brought, the same one that had started with a 340 copay 20 years earlier, now grown to include a certified copy of the deed of trust, my father's letter, and a 1-page summary I'd built the way I build every fraud examination summary for a client, dated, itemized, unembellished. "I'm not here to take the house," I said. My voice was flat. "I want you to understand that flatness was the point. I have sat across tables like this one my entire career, reading numbers to executives who very much did not want to hear them, and I know that calm is not the absence of feeling, it's the discipline of not letting the other side see where the feeling lives. I'm here because Dad recorded a legitimate financial instrument reflecting money I put into this family for 15 years, money none of you ever disputed at the time you asked for it. I have never once tried to enforce it. I didn't even know it existed until 5 years ago, and I sat on it for 5 more because I genuinely did not want this conversation. You're the one who made it necessary, Mom, not me." "Necessary," she repeated, and her voice cracked on the second syllable, just slightly, 4 seconds of something real breaking through before she pulled it back under control. "Your father never once told me. Do you understand what that felt like? Finding out my own husband had a secret account with our daughter that I knew nothing about? And there it was, the one honest crack the whole meeting was going to give me, not guilt about me, but grief and betrayal about him, about a marriage I'd never fully understood the inside of." I watched her hand shake for exactly as long as it took her to reach for the water glass, and then I watched her set the glass down and straighten her shoulders and go right back to the script. "But that's beside the point. This is Derek's house. It was always going to be Derek's house. You should be grateful, Elena. Not everyone gets to be the responsible one." I let that sentence sit in the room for a moment. Same words, same tone she'd used in that living room 5 years earlier, in front of 23 relatives. "You're right," I said. "Not everyone gets to be the responsible one, but everyone gets to stop." I did not raise my voice. I want to be honest, this is the one moment in the whole meeting where my voice did something close to shake, but I kept it flat anyway, out of pure will. "I'm not enforcing the full amount of this note. I don't want Derek's kids to lose their home, and I don't think Dad wanted that either, whatever else was true. What I want is for this family to finally put my name on the ledger where it belongs. So here's what I'll do. I'll restructure the note into a 15-year repayment plan, interest-free, and I'll subordinate it so the bank can complete Derek's refinance. Derek pays it directly to me, on a schedule Roger draws up today, and it comes with exactly one condition that has nothing to do with money." My mother started to say something else, something with the word generous already forming in it in a way that I could tell wasn't going to land the way she thought it would, and I held up one hand, not sharply, just enough. "I'm not finished," I said. "There's a condition." Roger Voss, sitting at the head of the table with his own copy of the note in front of him, didn't say a word. Just watched the way lawyers do when they already know exactly where a conversation is headed and are letting it get there on its own. Derek, who had said almost nothing the entire meeting, finally spoke, and his voice was the one that actually broke, not my mother's. "What condition?" he said, and I watched him wipe his face fast with the back of his hand, the way men do when they're trying to pretend they aren't doing what they're obviously doing. "You call me," I said. "Not Mom on your behalf. You. Once a month for the life of the plan, and you tell me the truth about how it's going, even when it's bad. That's it. That's the whole condition." My mother did not apologize. I want to be honest with you about that because I know some of you are hoping this story ends with her crying and asking for forgiveness across that conference table, and it didn't happen, and I've made my peace with the fact that it probably never will. What she said instead, after a long silence I clocked at 19 seconds, was, "Well, I suppose that's generous of you," which is, if you know my mother, roughly as close to gratitude as she is capable of getting, and even that came wrapped in something that still sounded like she believed she was doing me a favor by accepting it. There was one more person in that room I haven't told you about, a young paralegal from Roger's office named Priya, who'd been quietly taking notes for the file the entire meeting. As we were leaving, she caught my eye in the hallway, and instead of saying anything about the case, she just said, "For what it's worth, that was the most composed I've ever seen anyone handle a room like that." It was a small, unnecessary kindness from someone with nothing at stake in my family, and I've thought about it more than I probably should, because it was the only moment that whole day that had no agenda attached to it at all. If this story has meant anything to you so far, I want you to subscribe and tell me one thing in the comments. What's the one sentence your family says to you that you've never once heard them say to anyone else? I read every comment, and I promise you, whatever your sentence is, someone else watching this has heard almost the exact same words. I want to tell you what happened in the year that followed, because the resolution to a story like this is never as clean as the confrontation itself, and I don't want to leave you with a Hollywood ending that isn't true. Derek called me on the first of the month, every month for the first 6 months, exactly as agreed. 3 of those calls were about the payment. The other 3, he talked about things that had nothing to do with money at all: his kids, a job he was thinking about taking instead of trying landscaping a 4th time, once, quietly, an apology that had specific things attached to it instead of vague ones. "I should have told you I didn't know about the money situation growing up until I was older," he said, "but by the time I did know, I let it keep happening because it was easier than saying something. I'm sorry for that part. Not just the house. All of it. It wasn't everything. It was real, though, and specific, and I could hear him actually trying, which is more than I'd had from him in 15 years. Jenna started texting me too, separate from Derek, small things at first, a photo of their youngest on her first day of kindergarten, a recipe she thought I'd like. Around the 9th month, she told me she and Derek had started seeing a financial counselor together, something neither of them had ever done in either of Derek's marriages, and that the counselor had actually used the word pattern in a session, out loud, about the way Derek had been raised to expect rescue instead of consequence. I don't know exactly what that counselor said behind closed doors, and it isn't really my business, but I noticed the payments started coming a few days early instead of a few days late, somewhere around month 10, and small changes like that tend to mean more than big speeches ever do. My mother sent one message in the months that followed, a text, not a call, 3 weeks after the meeting. "Hope you're doing well? Derek says the payments are on track." No apology. No acknowledgement of the will, the meeting, the 23 relatives, the years before that. Just a flat transactional update, the same register she'd used with me my entire life. I responded with 2 words: glad to. I have not heard from her since, and I want to be honest with you. Some days that silence still aches in a specific old place in my chest, and other days it feels like the first quiet room I've had in 20 years. Ruth still calls every Sunday. Daniel and I had our second child that spring, a boy we named Walter, and Ruth was in the delivery room within 4 hours of the call going out, the same way she'd shown up in that hospital cafeteria all those years ago, unasked, just present. Our house, the one 4 streets over from the maple tree house we didn't get, is loud most evenings now, in the good way. Dinner at 6:30, our daughter arguing with Daniel about homework, baby Walter, loud about anything at all. Ruth comes for Sunday dinner once a month in person now, instead of just calling, and she still makes the same yellow and gray pattern for anyone in the family who has a baby, 4 blankets and counting. It's a small, ordinary life, and after 15 years of measuring my worth in wire transfers, ordinary is the thing I wanted most and understood least how to ask for. My father's reading glasses, the ones with the hinge he'd taped instead of replacing because he said the frame still had years left in it, sit on a shelf in my home office now, next to the folder, the original one, the one that started at 340 and ended, in a walnut desk drawer, as a father's quiet proof that he'd been counting too. I still have the coffee can of nickels and dimes too, the one we found on my father's windowsill after he died. It sits on the same shelf as his glasses now, and every so often, usually on nights when I can't sleep, I'll pick it up just to feel the weight of it. $900 a factory foreman saved for reasons none of us ever got to ask him about. I like to think it was for something small and specific, a fishing trip, a tool he wanted, nothing grand. I'll never know. That's the thing about the quiet ones. you spend your whole life reading everything else about them, and the smallest mysteries are the ones that stay unsolved the longest. That's my story. 15 years, 41 items in a folder that started with a single copay, and one brass key on a piece of fishing line that I carried for 5 years before I understood what it was actually unlocking. If you take one thing from this, let it be this. Love that only shows up as an invoice isn't love, it's an arrangement, and you're allowed to stop honoring an arrangement nobody ever let you negotiate. You don't owe anyone your silence just because they raised you, and if somebody in your life only calls you back the moment your circumstances change, that's not a relationship rediscovering you. That's a ledger, finally being read by someone who was hoping you'd never check the math. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe, share it with someone who's been the responsible one in their family for a little too long, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now, because I promise you, somewhere out there, it's 2 a.m. For somebody too, and I want them to know they're not the only one still awake doing the math. That's my story, and I'll see you in the next one.